Okay, today we have informal session, and we have Paul Brosh to talk to us about harmful algae blooms and their relevance to Clermont County.
Well, I'm going to keep this really short. I'm Paul Brosh from the Office of Environmental Quality, and I'm just going to introduce some other people to talk to you today, but we're going to have Hannah Lubers, who's going to, from the Office of Environmental Quality, it's going to talk a little bit about harmful algal blooms, and then Mark Day and Tim Nyer with the Water Resources with the Water Division. But what we're going to talk about, what are harmful algal blooms, and why is this a problem for us and many other people? And I think most people are familiar with the problems that Toledo had with their drinking water last summer. But and then what can we do about it? How do we identify it? How do we treat it? And how can we prevent it? And then Mark and Tim are going to talk about what they're doing to protect our drinking water here in Clermont County. But I did want a big part of this also, and they're not really representative here today, is our partnership that we have. We have a collaborative, the Watershed Collaborative here in Clermont County, and it started off, I want to say 15 years ago, maybe longer than that now, with the Scientific Advisory Committee. We had the late Paul Russell was a member, and we had some people from Miami University, and they were providing some technical expertise. And the challenge that would been given to me from the county administrator and the commissioners was we needed to understand our watershed better than what Ohio EPA understood our watershed, and we needed to understand what was impacting the water quality here. Well, that partnership, that Scientific Advisory Committee, has evolved dramatically. And today, I have to say that we have what is now the collaborative is probably the most unique and strongest scientific advisory group and input into what's going on in our watershed is probably better understood than almost any watershed in the country. We have the U.S. EPA, Office of Research and Development, which is leasing the stream facility down on US 50, and they bring an immense amount of knowledge and background in this area. We're also working with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. We've got the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. We've got U.S. Geological Service, or Survey, and then we have NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. They were unique. When they came to the meeting, we were talking about doing some remote sensing for HAB, and a professor from UC said, well, we have a drone we could use for doing remote sensing, and the guy from NOAA says, well, we have a satellite we can use. It's an impressive piece of equipment that I never envisioned that we would have access to in doing research in Clermont County. We also have Ohio EPA involved. We have Department of Natural Resources. We have Ohio State University. We have our Office of Environmental Quality. We have the Water Resources Department, people with the Water and Sewer Division that provide expertise. We have Clermont Soil and Water Conservation District. We have the Brown County Soil and Water Conservation District, and we have UC Clermont involved. And this is just meetings we have are just immensely informative, and this level of cooperation and expertise is I've never heard of it anyplace else. It's I think something to be really proud of. But that's not what we came to talk about. We came to talk about HAB, and I'm going to let Hannah tell you more about.
Hey, Hannah.
Good morning. Morning.
So Paul mentioned harmful algal blooms have been making national headlines lately when Toledo had to ban their drinking water last year for 3 days. This is a picture of Toledo, of the intake at Toledo. This is not from Lake Harsha, just be mindful of that. But we have
Careful to, yeah, point that out.
yeah, that's not from Lake Harsha.
Not our lake.
So
Put a
we have
lime
little
on that.
more. What now?
Put a lime on that. It might
Looks like it's got lime.
So it kind of looks like Green Beer Day or something.
An umbrella, right?
We have had some local headlines, though. This kind of glaring headline reported that toxin levels were 3,000% higher than normal levels last year. So what are HABs? They're actually made of bacteria, not algae, but they do perform photosynthesis like algae do. So they're commonly referred to as blue-green algae. A HAB is comprised of the cyanobacteria or blue-green algae that are known to release toxins. But if a HAB is present, it doesn't actually have to be releasing toxins at that time to be considered a HAB. These toxins can cause human and animal illnesses. There are different types of toxins. They can be skin toxins, liver toxins, and nervous system toxins. One type of algae can produce multiple types of toxins at one time. We typically see microcystin in Harsha Lake, but we have seen saxitoxin, very trace levels. Because these toxins are dangerous, Ohio EPA and ODNR will monitor them in beaches where someone has called in and said there might be a HAB present. They monitor, they'll monitor the toxins in the communities, the different species present. And for example, if microcystin toxin is greater than 6 parts per billion, they'll post this orange sign. It's a recreational public health advisory sign. And if microcystin is greater than 20 parts per billion, that's the World Health Organization criteria or recommendation. And there has to be a human illness or a pet death, then they'll post these red signs. We've had the orange signs at Harsha Lake, but not the red signs. The sign on the left is just kind of a general awareness sign that warning residents, people using the water, just to be aware that there's algae out there and it could be harmful. So because these can result in beach closures and have pet deaths have happened, a lot of dog deaths have happened over the years, this can have widespread impacts. Recreation, like I mentioned, economic impacts as a result of reduced recreational use. Grand Lake St. Mary's, they've had really bad problems up there, and they're estimating that because it's such a high tourism area that they've lost like $40 million in tourism revenue. Wow. Also, because it makes the drinking water harder to drink, it can impact drinking water treatment as well, and Mark and Tim are going to cover that later.
Did you know where that picture was taken?
Yeah, a lot of these pictures are not from Lake Harsha. We don't have that many pictures. This is a fish kill, and I believe that's Grand Lake St. Mary's.
Okay.
This picture is from Lake Harsha. This was taken near the beach in 2012, and it's become kind of a famous picture. It's in a lot of talks. It's on Ohio EPA's website, so I don't know that we want to be famous by that way, but we are. The HAB issue really came to surface in 2009. Well, that's when Ohio EPA really started testing for it up at Grand Lake St. Mary's. They came down to our neighborhood and started monitoring for HABs in 2012. We had our first advisory in 2013. These were for microcystin. And we also saw we had 2 orange signs posted last year due to peak microcystin toxin was detected at 190 parts per billion. We have a regional swim meet that's held here annually, and that was moved to a different park, a different lake. And then this summer, we're looking forward to the National Rowing Championships being held here. And that's the 2nd week of July, and we actually, looking at historical HAB data in Lake Harsha, we typically start seeing blooms the 2nd week of June. So we will be kind of keeping our eye on the HABs then this summer. Because the sampling for toxins and for algae is expensive and limited, Ohio EPA typically only does it weekly, but bloom conditions and toxin concentrations can change very rapidly. So also the signs can't be posted everywhere where people have contact with the water. So we just want to tell residents to don't just rely on the signs, and when in doubt, stay out. This was taken at Lake Harsha Lake. This is the campground beach when we had the advisory. There's a sign posted there, and those kids are swimming in it anyway. These cyanobacteria have been around for billions of years, so why are we seeing this problem now? What we know about cyanobacteria is they really like warm temperatures, sunlight, calm water, kind of the conditions we see in the lake over the summer. But they also need nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, just like other algae do. they need kind of different concentrations or ratios of nitrogen and phosphorus than green algae do. So that's one clue. They have advantages over green algae, such as they're able to fix nitrogen. If nitrogen is low in the water, they can get that from the atmosphere. They can also regulate buoyancy in the water column. They can float down and get resources from the bottom of the lake and then float back up to the surface to get sunlight. Some theories as to why we're seeing increases in algae bloom is basically changes in farming practices, different types of fertilizer that they might be using, and also weather. Changes in weather. We've had some pretty extreme weather patterns the last few years where we have pretty strong storms in the spring, and then we seem to have longer, warmer temperatures, creating that environment that the HABs like. But we do know that they're here to stay. They typically, once they show up in a lake, that seems like they get worse every year, which is the pattern we've seen in Harsha Lake. And it's because they have resting cells that kind of overwinter in the lake, and then they come back when conditions are favorable in the spring and summer. So how can we get rid of these? Make them go away. There's kind of two different ways of dealing with them. There's short-term treatment and long-term treatment. Short-term treatment kind of involves doing chemical application or maybe physical methods such as dredging or aeration, but these are not cost-effective on large reservoirs such as Harsha Lake. They actually tried a pilot project like this, doing some of these, they did alum treatment and they did dredging up at Grand Lake St. Mary's, and they spent like $4 million, and they still weren't able to make a good dent in covering the entire lake. So we'd have a hard time doing that here. So then we have to look towards more long-term solutions, and we look at preventing the HABs from blooming. So we look to source water protection.
So in copper solvent, that's just supposed to keep the sun from penetrating on
That actually kills the algae.
it? It kills it? I know they use that on ponds and everything too.
Yeah, that'll kill the algae. And it also, when you kill the algae, that's when they release the toxins. So that can be dangerous. You have to really watch the timing of that if you use copper sulfate.
Wow.
Also, Hannah, this blue-green algal is on the surface primarily, so deeper down you don't see it because there's lack of sunlight. Is that right?
Right. But they do have the ability to move lower in the water column than that they can get nutrients that might not be available. Because you typically, in a lake that's stratified, you have like more phosphorus in the bottom of the lake. So. Paul mentioned the East Fork Watershed Cooperative. We're really lucky to have these guys helping us with all of the research. It's really cutting edge research. We're looking at ways to identify the blooms, prevent the blooms, and treat the blooms. So if we're going to try to prevent the blooms, we need to kind of reduce the source of the blooms, what's feeding the blooms. We know nutrients and weather seem to be culprits. We can't really control the weather, so we're going to look at nutrients. Where are the nutrients coming from? This is an annual nutrient load distribution to the Harsha Lake watershed, and you can see like 80% of the nitrogen is coming from agricultural runoff and 97% of the phosphorus is coming from agricultural runoff. This is data we've acquired from our watershed cooperative. So what can we do to reduce agricultural runoff? Farmers can voluntarily sign up for cost-shared programs to add BMPs to their fields, but we don't really know.
BMP?
It's a best management practice.
Okay, thank you.
So like cover crops or nutrient management, grassed waterways. We don't really know how well those work at removing nutrients from the water. We just, kind of apply them and see what happens. Well, our cooperative actually has 2 grants right now to see how those BMPs can improve water quality. The first one, the Conservation Innovation Grant, is we're in the 4th of 5 years of that right now. We built a treatment system shown here that will remove nutrients, and we have water quality monitoring stations upstream and downstream of that treatment system so we can tell what the impact is. We also just received up almost $500,000 with the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, and that'll allow us to implement thousands of acres of best management practices such as cover crops and nutrient management programs. And then we'll be able to measure water quality from the fields implementing those programs, and then from fields that are just practicing conventional farming methods so we can see what the difference in nutrient runoff is. This is actually a picture. Last year we had the Deputy Director of the US EPA coming down to see our site, so this project is getting national recognition. So once we have the data on the ground showing how well the BMPs are working, we can use our watershed model to simulate what it would be like if we had those BMPs on a large percentage of land coverage in the watershed. So then we can determine if we had all these BMPs in the watershed, would water quality improve at the lake and possibly reduce the amount of blooms that we're seeing. Our model is also really helpful for identifying best management practice, the best location for those practices. And this is really cutting edge. Nobody has really done this before in their watershed. This is a picture of the watershed draining into the lake. And the red spots here are fields that are having higher nitrogen runoff than like the yellow fields do. So we can place our BMPs in those areas and get more bang for our buck in reducing nutrient runoff. Looking at the lake, we really want to focus on identifying less expensive or more rapid assessment of the blooms. Right now, Ohio EPA will monitor them about weekly, and it can take a day to a couple days to maybe even weeks for some of the data to come back. And our beach managers and plant managers really need the data quicker than that. One way we can identify more quickly when the blooms are happening is by remote sensing, and Paul kind of referred to this a little bit. But you have to have data on the ground that you can build a relationship to the satellite imagery. And so last year they conducted a remote sensing project where we had multiple teams and crews going out and sampling at all these little dots on this map. This is Lake Harsha here. And then at the same time we had the UC aircraft flying over and the satellite flying over getting the remote sensing data. So eventually when they'll be able to process this data, hopefully we can look at the satellite data and predict when these blooms are coming, when they're at their greatest strength, and hopefully what kind of toxins we might see in the water. This map here is kind of showing you where the different beaches are. The red, this is really preliminary data, but the red is just kind of showing where cyanobacteria are more predominant in the water, and you can see that's right next to the campground beach, which is where we typically see higher toxin concentrations.
Those numbers don't correspond to your table on the left side. Is there a different?
Yeah, the numbers here, those have to do with some kind of relationship between the toxins in the samples and the predictive ability of the remote sensing data. But more importantly, I just wanted to show you the level of effort that was done sampling the lake, and then also where the Bob McEwen drinking water intake is located, right on the lake. And Mark, I'll hand it off to Mark and Tim.
So do we know how the satellite or aircraft identify blooms? Is it color, visual? Is it color, specific colors, or?
Yeah, it's a wavelength.
It's a spectral analysis.
Okay.
And blue-green algae reflect light at like the blue and green spectrum portion of light. So.
Okay.
So do you want me to control this? I'll hand it off to Mark. He's going to talk about how they're treating this drinking water and making it safe for the residents of Clermont County.
Okay, talk a little bit about HAB history at the plant. Actually, taste and odors associated with blue-greens have been present at the BMW plant since it was commissioned in 1995. We had seasonal taste and odor events. We suspected MIB in geosmin based upon some reading I had done. So we acquired a closed-loop stripping apparatus so we could concentrate the samples down to the parts per trillion level and tested it with the GC mass spec in our laboratory. And we, in fact, detected MIB in geosmin. MIB in geosmin is detectable by the human palate at concentrations as low as 10 parts per trillion. To put that in perspective, 10 parts per trillion is 10 inches and 16 million miles. So this stuff is very detectable by the human palate. BMW was designed and built as a conventional surface water treatment plant. The original design using powdered activated carbon was not effective for complete removal of the MIB and geosmin, the taste and odor compounds. GAC caps were added to the filters in 1999. The focus of those caps was more to do with herbicide removal, atrazine, simazine. But we got a side benefit from that they actually effectively removed the MIB and Josmin for as long as 2 years.
Granular activated charcoal.
Carbon, yes.
Carbon.
And the
Granular
caps,
activated carbon. Okay.
the caps were removed from the filters, and full-scale GAC contactors were constructed in 2012, concurrent with the first microsystem detection, as Hannah referred to earlier. So we'll talk about the best available treatment technologies for the removal of intact cells. Basically, the little floater guys that you saw in Hannah's jar, those are the intact cells. The best available technology currently known is coagulation and sedimentation, which is a part of a conventional surface water purification, rapid sand filtration, which our plant is equipped with, slow sand filtration, membrane processes, and dissolved air flotation. Dissolved air flotation is another fancier version of coagulation and sedimentation. It basically has a smaller footprint, but it yields the same results. Now, the best available technology is known to remove the extracellular toxins, i.e. the microcystin, once the bacteria has released these toxins, is powdered activated carbon, which we used to have, granular activated carbon, which we currently have in place, biological filtration, which if you operate your filters and your granulated carbon contactors effectively, you can maintain a biological film in the filter media that's effective at removing the toxins. Membrane processes, which is some of the newer technology, reverse osmosis, some of those technologies, and oxidation. And oxidation actually just destroys the toxin. It doesn't physically remove it, it just destroys it. So the technologies that we currently have available is combined coagulation, sedimentation, and filtration for the algal cell removal. The GAC is known to be effective to remove all extracellular toxins. Potassium permanganate, which is a strong oxidant, chlorine, which is a strong oxidant, and a multiple level intake structure. Toledo, one of the problems they have is they have a fixed level intake. Their crib draws from at or near the surface of the reservoir. We can go as deep as 53 feet down. So these little guys are known to be buoyant, and we can actually, if we know where they are in the water column, we can open and close intake levels to avoid the bloom altogether.
Hey, Mark, quick question. I know we have a lot of different technologies there on your last slide, and some of them we're going to use no matter what, but what's the actual cost per year having this blue-green algae in Harsha Lake? Is there something that we're doing extra? Fair question?
No, we're not really. I mean, probably the monitoring and testing is our biggest cost now. You know, the GAC, we're continually using that for other organics of concern. And so that the toxins just goes into that long list of things that we see the GAC as being a safety net for. So, but the actual cost of testing, sending Tim to Akron to get him trained, and all of these extra things that's going on that he'll be talking about in a little bit is arguably our cost.
So basically, we put in some pretty sophisticated water treatment in Harsha Lake as we did it, and some of the benefit of that is it deals with blue-green algae as well as the other stuff that we put it in to watch and
that is
take
correct.
out of the water supply. So we did good, not really predicting this was our outcome, but it has a good outcome as well.
So is there a point at which the blue-green algae gets so strong that we switch over to the well fields on the river, or can we treat anything with the granular activated carbon?
You're getting ahead of me, but yeah, actually, yeah, we're going to talk about that in a moment.
All right.
We're going to on the earlier question, does the blue-green algae use up the carbon quicker? And have
That's,
to regenerate the
again,
carbon?
you're getting into Tim's stuff. So,
We'll cover that later.
So when we talk about the oxidant inactivation, it's important to recognize that all of these different oxidation technologies have more or less effects on the 4 different types of toxin that comes from the blue-greens. As you can see with chlorine, the microcystin and the cylindrospermopsin, the 2 that we've actually detected in raw water, is effective at destroying those toxins. The anatoxin and saxitoxin that we have not yet seen at the intake, in one case they're not effective, and in the other they're somewhat effective. Potassium permanganate, you can see it's effective at the anatoxin, but it's not as effective as the saxitoxin as well as the chlorine. And it is important to note that oxygens should only be used in the absence of intact cells, because there's a theory that if you kill the cells that they'll release this toxin. So this technology would better be used after the algal cells have either been physically removed in the sedimentation and filtration, and you're just dealing with the toxin alone. Then these oxidants are effective at destroying them. But if you apply this oxidant to an active bloom, there's a chance that you could actually make it worse. So Tim has to be very careful
Make
how.
the release of the toxin worse. Yeah.
Correct. And here's our other considerations.
We use all of those.
We use chlorine and potassium permanganate.
Okay.
So here's some other tools that I have in my toolbox in the event that we get, have an issue with toxins. We can increase production at our 2 other groundwater treatment plants to maximum capacity, reduce the flow or stop the flow from BMW. We can utilize interconnections with Greater Cincinnati Waterworks, Tate Monroe, and Western Water. And heaven forbid we could use water use restrictions to reduce the demand on the system so that the plants and the connections that we have are of adequate capacity to serve the needs of our customers. Now we're going to let Tim talk about some of the stuff he's been working on and will be working on relative to kind of like the future. I started the plant in 1995. I've been dealing with it all these years, and now Tim's the new champion, and it'll be up to him to kind of deal with some of these upcoming future considerations.
So Hannah had talked about some of the aerial monitoring and some of the other monitoring that takes place, but that doesn't give a full picture. That's more of a model, a predictive indicator of whether or not you have a problem. So we have to do some actual testing to determine what the levels are. As has already been mentioned, the Ohio EPA goes to the beach on a regular basis, and they'll collect samples. There currently aren't any regulations as far as whether or not we are required to sample. According to the U.S. EPA or the Ohio EPA, the U.S. EPA is going to be coming out on May 11th with their recommendations. What they will probably be doing is giving guidelines as opposed to specific levels. It'll be more of a guideline. But we will go out in conjunction with the Ohio EPA. They'll be doing their testing. If they detect certain levels at the beaches, then they'll kind of step up their testing more frequent and at additional locations. They'll then come to our intake. They typically will collect samples. Also at our finished water tap, they'll be collecting samples to determine whether or not there's an issue or whether they need to issue any advisories. In-house, we have the ability to do testing as well. There's a specific company called Abraxas that does an ELISA test. So it will actually test for the actual specific type of toxins. And there are many different types of, as we've seen, many different types of the HABs and different types of toxins they produce. One of the difficulties is you can test in many different ways, but it's difficult to isolate it down. The congeners required to test for each individual protein is very difficult. So the type of test we perform is kind of a total number, which will give us worst case scenario. the benefit is that we can control the testing, we can control the results, we can get results relatively quickly. The problem is it takes a little bit of time. It's time demanding on the staff, and it's relatively costly. The more samples we run, obviously the higher the cost goes. We can contract that out to other labs. Obviously, that requires minimal time from our staff, but then we have delays in results, and it's even more expensive to do those sampling events.
Don't we contract some stuff out now?
Not for HABs, we don't, no.
Yeah, but for other things.
Yes, yes. And that is one benefit, that we do have labs that are currently under contract with, say, the wastewater department, where we don't have to get them signed up as a new vendor. I can just collect a sample. We've got a purchase order with them already. We can go ahead and in the event we need to, we can send that out. So there's a lot of research that's going on right now, and Paul had discussed the collaborative effort. One of the efforts that started from that collaborative effort is specific HAB research that the US EPA is doing out at our intake. So that top right picture is the lower level of my intake, and that's instrumentations and sensors and monitors that the US EPA is using to collect real-time data that can be sent via telemetry back to the plant, back to the US EPA's Office of Research and Development down at UC, or down in Clifton. So we can find out real time what's going on. So there's three locations that they monitor. That little yellow buoy is about 300 yards off the shore. We're collecting data from that. We collect data from the surface at the intake, and then also off our raw water. So as Mark had said, we've got 3 different levels. We can determine what the level is at our intake. That will kind of help us determine what the best treatment alternatives are, or when I have an issue coming, knowing that it's coming will help me out. We're also in efforts with a cluster group, Confluence, and this group also involves a lot of the same organizations as does the Confluence, or does the collaborative effort. But the other thing is that this organization tries to bring in industry to say, hey, what are the needs of the utilities? Where are the shortcomings? And how can we get industry involved to bring them in to help solve our problems? And so we're very much involved with Confluence as well. Also this summer, we're planning on doing quite a bit of additional testing that we hadn't done in the past. This is a relative, even though HAB has been around for millions of years, the drinking water side is a relatively new field. So there's a lot of holes in the research. There's a lot of things that we need to learn about our own treatment process. And so this summer we're going to be doing an extensive testing in-house to find out what's going on in our process. What are we doing to aid the problem? What are we doing to potentially making the problem worse? And how does that work through our treatment process? So we're going to do quite extensive testing this year to better manage the efforts that we are doing with the treatment process in-house.
And to add on to that, since we put this slide presentation together, late Thursday night, my cell phone's ringing off the hook. An old connection of mine from actually Greater Cincinnati Waterworks, who went to Northern Kentucky University and then on to Wayne State University. She called me and looking for our support for an additional USDA funded project to develop probes that you can put in your treatment train that would detect these toxins. So I sent her a letter of support on Friday. We're hoping that she would be successful in getting that grant, and Tim would be working with that study as well to put probes in the treatment train that would effectively tell you what these concentrations are. So our involvement would be putting the probes that they've already developed in place. Tim's group would be responsible for pulling samples so they can do comparison of what the read was from the probe to what the actual bench analysis tells us. And this is kind of like a QA/QC thing that tells us if this probe is actually accurate. So that, my apology, that came in after the slideshow was developed, and she was calling me late Thursday night, so that's another study that hopefully we'll be a part of.
Mark, you've been, you said at the Bob McEwen plant since 1995. When did the blue-green algae really start becoming an issue? What year?
The year we started it. We had terrible taste and odor events in the summer of 1995 after that plant went online. We tried to use powdered activated carbon. We actually modified the feed equipment to feed even more powdered activated carbon than what the plant was designed to feed. It didn't touch the stuff. So every year we went through these little blurps of taste and odor events, and again we validated that with the MIB and Josman testing, because I started picking up books and reading about other systems in this country that's having these earthy, musty types of taste and odor complaints, and it was all kind of, you know, right in the same belt as us relative to the weather patterns. They were all man-made impounded reservoirs. And it was interesting to see all the different water companies' approach to dealing with this. You know, my approach was to get testing equipment, find out if we actually had these compounds, and then figure out how to remove them. There was a utility in California that actually beefed up their customer service to where they had folks that were highly trained in how to talk with the customers and explain why this is going on, and it, you know, it won't hurt you, and it's just, you know, it's aesthetic, and they would bring in these mass quantities of customer service folks to take the complaints, to handle the phone calls, and rather than trying to remove it, treat it, deal with it. And I was like, no, that's not going to work for us. So we got the testing ability. We started getting hits on the MIB and Josman, and thus the side benefit of the carbon caps in '99 was that it effectively removed this stuff.
But when did we actually start closing down the beach and things like that? I mean,
2012. Yeah.
That was when it...
So, I mean, microcystin and some of these toxins didn't, you know, the ability to detect for them, I think there was other places like Australia, some other countries that were ahead of us relative to this algal toxin research. Mm-hmm. But for us, it was from '95 when I commissioned the plant until they actually started seeing the toxins and we started seeing these as buzzwords. It was a aesthetic thing for us. It was taste and odor until we got. And
at the taste and odor level, you were saying it's extremely low levels that our palate
correct
tastes it much before it's any kind of a threat to us.
Yeah, well, the MIB
what we had back in the early day was simply taste and odor, and we were trying to deal with taste and odor.
Correct.
And the only time it's been a health issue is 2012 forward. But essentially, our treatment has been able to take care of even that.
Lined up perfectly.
It's in the lake water, but it's not in our drinking water.
Yeah, it lined up perfectly with the installation of our new granular activated carbon contactors. So
good.
And I do want to add that we've never had a detectable level in our finished drinking water.
Right.
We've had the EPA out sampling, and we've collected samples as well, and we've never had a detectable level in our finished water. We've had it in the raw water, and it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of magnitude every year in the raw water. We will have it again this year. As Hannah had said, the cells lie dormant, and it's just a matter of the right environment in which they become active again, and they can self-regulate through the water column, so they can move up and down day to night to collect nutrients or to go get sunlight. So it's difficult because if you collect a sample at 9 a.m., it might be completely different at 5 p.m. versus 9 p.m. So the time at which we do the samples, and it's not as cut and simple as it.
These guys hide.
Yes, exactly.
They move around.
That's how they've evolved over time. It's how they stayed around, because they're able to outcompete other types of algae that are not that advanced.
You know, the hypocrisy behind this whole thing is that the EPA is here trying to help us and resolve this problem, but at the same time, the EPA has been mandated to I guess, follow the Renewable Fuel Standard Acts from 2005, where we're trying to grow corn to create ethanol. And to grow corn, of course, it's phosphorus and nitrogen. Right. And as we're growing more and more corn, we're putting more and more fertilizers on the ground because we're doing nutrient depletion. So at one side, they're trying to help us with the blue-green algae. On the other side, they're trying to do the mandate for ethanol. So the solution to all this is to reform or get rid of the Renewable Fuel Standard Act mandate.
You know, piggybacking on that too, Hannah, you showed the slide about the percentage of cropland, farmland actually contributing to that. Now looking
Pie
at
charts.
Nutrients.
yeah, nutrients, but looking at that, do you know again the crop, like Commissioner Ubel said about, is it corn?
Right.
Which it probably is, but
We're pretty much corn and soybean.
Right.
So we know more information about like rotations and how they're used throughout the watershed, but
Well, corn production, I think in Ohio is up 40% since 2005.
And they have to apply these types of nutrients because if you don't alternate, like between soybeans and corn, because one adds nutrients back in the soil that the other takes out. So if they are concentrating on corn production and not doing that rotation, then there would be more
So
application.
if we can repeal or reform the ethanol standard, we're in great shape.
I've
Let's
also
spend our time there. Go ahead, Hannah.
I've also heard that the fertilizer they're using now for corn, they didn't used to have phosphorus in it or as much phosphorus in it, and now the fertilizer that's more affordable has phosphorus in it. And they're really after the nitrogen for corn. We have pretty high concentrations of phosphorus in the soil as it is already. We don't really need to add phosphorus typically.
You know, what's interesting is for residential purposes, if you want to buy fertilizer, you can buy fertilizer without the phosphorus in it.
Right.
Yeah.
you know, looking at again the contribution that farmland has to this, I was looking at the team that you all have, and I didn't see Ohio Department of Agriculture.
USDA is one of our.
USDA, but not Ohio.
Yeah, we haven't worked with them too much on
It-
this.
Because I didn't see that icon on your slide of partners.
Yeah, they haven't been maybe John.
Yeah, they haven't, and I don't know that, they would provide anything more or different than what, USDA through NRCS does. Lori Weinberg,
Uh-huh.
of course, is our district conservationist, and she's based in our office, so, I don't know that they would add anything to, the collaborative efforts right now that Lori doesn't provide.
Okay. Now, and question number two, every year we know that the lake turns over. Do we see such a difference in algal bloom and all that at that point?
Well, it's not necessarily that there's a bloom at that point.
Well, but I
So
mean
we
the
have-
effects of it.
And these are hypotheses. We do hypothesize that every fall there's that turnover and you have a death, algal cell death or the blue-green algae death. And at that point, then additional toxins will be released. It's also the time that we saw typically the taste and odor issues because once again the cells are dying. So yeah, we that's one of the things that we're going to look into. It's one of the things that Mark and I had discussed about last fall. We had some treatment issues towards the end of the summer, and then immediately followed by taste and odor. And luckily, with the way the process is set up now, we didn't have the issues in our finished water with taste and odor. But in the plant, you can definitely tell when there's that environment, if you will. But yeah, those are definitely linked. Traditionally, our highest levels of toxins tend to be the second week of June. It's right after fertilizer season. It's the longest day of the year. The waters are getting warm. The lake has turned over. So that also, when the lake turns over in the spring, it tends to bring the cells from the bottom that have been lying dormant, brings them up to the top, throws them right up in the sunlight. You've got the warm water. One of the other comments I wanted to make, getting back to Toledo, it's important for our communications folks to make sure that if we do have an event similar to this, that they get the proper information out quickly. Traditionally, if you would imagine, when you have an issue with water, what do you always do? You tend to boil it. Well, in this case, you would create a worse issue than if you weren't of boiling it, because you've now aerosolized all the toxins. And so showering in the water was obviously a problem, because then you're having the dermal exposure and you have the airborne toxin. If you boil the water, you would have problems. If you wash dishes in a dishwasher, you've then created a worse scenario than if you hadn't. So it's very important that the communications get out and the accurate information. When they say do not use, that's what they meant. They didn't mean boil your water. It wasn't a boil water advisory. And so in those instances, it's very important to get proper information out as quickly as possible.
That's if it's in the finished water,
Correct, correct.
which we haven't
We have never had, and that's my job to make sure that that never
We
happens.
don't expect
Absolutely.
it. But in Toledo, it was in finished water,
Yes.
and that was, and they don't use the same treatment process we do.
They do not have the granular activated carbon. They had powdered activated carbon. That's what Mark was saying. When we had attempted years ago to treat the MIB and Josmin with powdered activated carbon, it was deemed ineffective.
Okay.
And so they have since made some modifications. They are hoping that this year that they'll be able to treat for it in Toledo, but that's yet to be seen.
Okay.
Just, I might also mention back to the discussion about the agricultural runoff, is we're doing some monitoring at the edge of the field. We're looking at what runs off the edge of fields, and we're looking at best management practices and how do those impact. And there's really not a lot of information out there in the literature about what is the real impact of best management practices on what runs off. And so through some of that, one of the slides had white boxes and solar panels.
Yep.
On it. That's some edge of field monitoring that we're doing. It has some best management practices, and we're also doing monitoring in fields that don't have any best management. And hopefully from monitoring those edge of fields, we can provide data to our model that will then say, if we want to really reduce the amount of nutrients, we have to have this many acres in this type of best management practice. So that's some real unique research that the team is doing out there.
Well, otherwise, riparian, corridors are important along there too. And also, you're talking about the edge of field too, having a strip, between where
Part of the best management practice.
up to the stream, as far as the natural filtering.
Keeping that soil in the field.
Absolutely.
Soil and water conservation.
That's right.
Okay, is there anything else? Well, we thank you very much for the update. That was very educational, I think. And is there anything else we need to do today in our informal session? Okay, then that concludes our informal session. Thanks for joining us, and God bless.